Hi. The title of my paper is Flipping the Chemistry Switch: The Benefits of Flipped Instruction in the High School Chemistry Classroom. My name is Ashley Morgan. I'm from Frankenmuth, Michigan. However, I did spend some time in South Carolina. I chose this topic because chemistry is just a tough class. I think every single high school student comes into that class on day one with preconceived notions about performance for the year. So, chemistry, I mean, it is difficult. The purpose of my research in particular is to explore, some other alternatives to traditional instruction in the high school chemistry classroom. Now, the original study was written to occur over the course of a year. However, the actual study done for the purposes of this class was just over one content unit, which ended up being just around 2 weeks of instruction. So, as I mentioned, high school chemistry students often experience, being overwhelmed and they feel like they can never be successful in the class. And I really think that, this comes from a lack of connection with the data or the content and what can be learned through experiments and other laboratory experiences. And I would really say that this disconnect between the chemistry content and, the student performance is just that traditional teaching practices might not work for everybody. And, I can't speak for other chemistry teachers, but perhaps it's a little bit easier to just do traditional practices when you're teaching such a math heavy course while trying to instill these new science concepts to these students. Now, is the flipped classroom the way to go? I don't know. But the purpose of my research is to see, okay, can this work? Can this help? Minimal research has actually been done, or at least has been documented in terms of high school chemistry courses. Now, there has been some research done involving flipped instruction at the post-secondary level. So there was a study done at Brigham Young in a statistics course involving students having traditional instruction versus flipped instruction, and the results, while there was a slight difference in performance, the results weren't statistically significant. And the same is true for another study that did actually involve a first year chemistry course at the university level. And again, mean scores weren't statistically different despite the change in learning environments. And, I think that at the high school level, it could be a little bit different than at the post-secondary level. However, students are students, and I just think, we need to come up with a different way to help our students be successful in these upper level science classes. Now, there was a study done at Purdue where they took standardized tests written by the American Chemical Society, and they studied student scores, comparing across varying sections of an introductory chemistry course. So it wasn't the same students that were being surveyed. It was, similar students in a similar course at the same university. Now, there was definitely a difference in the distribution of the normal or the norm scores, the norm status of student performance. But again, was this statistically significant? I don't know. It doesn't seem as though it was reported as though it was. Now, for my study, because this was only over one unit of content in high school chemistry, I just did a pre and post test. So it was the unit in chemistry was chemical bonds and naming of chemical compounds. So we studied concepts including ionic bonds and covalent bonds, and then the compounds that result as those types of bonds are created. And we took a naming test essentially at the beginning of the unit and at the end of the unit. And every student did better at the end, so that's good news. However, the students who were in my traditional course or traditional setting, they ridiculously outperformed the students in the flipped setting. Now, I did calculate raw score data on the pre and post tests, and again, there was just an increase all around. However, we're talking an average score increase between the pre-test and the post-test for My flipped students was about 89% increase. So decent and worth the time, definitely. However, my standard instruction students, their scores increased over 100%, close to 135% greater than their pretest scores, which the question is then why do students do better in my particular classroom setting? Was it the unit? Was it the nature of the videos that I provided for them, etc.? I did also collect survey data to balance out this mixed methods approach. And, I just gave them a Google Form survey anonymously, and they just were asked to fill it out completely honestly. And I think that that's where some of my really telltale data comes in, because the scores, obviously, everybody did better. So it's kind of hard to argue that the flipped classroom isn't really beneficial because they still did better than they had performed on the pretest. However, again, it comes with, is it better than traditional instruction? And that's, again, the purpose of this research. Now, I do want to pull a quote from one of my students who responded to a survey question that really essentially just said, do you think that the flipped classroom is like worth pursuing in chemistry? Like, do you think students can be successful? And I had a couple of students who said, yeah, like it was fine. The videos were fine. Another student said, I really like having the teacher with me. But one student mentioned, and I quote, I believe that watching videos elsewhere and having the whole class time to do homework has potential for high success. Having the whole class period to do homework allows students more time to ask questions to the teacher one-on-one, and it allows the teacher to get a good idea on how everyone is doing on the certain lessons, end quote. The videos that I selected for this particular unit, I didn't create. Now, I have created some video lessons in the past, for things like a day where I'm going to be out, or just for further elaboration or expansion on a topic. And I purposely did not use those in this study. I wanted it to be, can my students learn without me having to spend a ton of time doing all these extra videos? Now, one can argue that that wasn't really sound data because I had students learning from someone who wasn't me. However, I did preview the videos and I made sure that they were tied into what I was teaching in the classroom. So it wasn't so much that I, was showing videos to these students that weren't, useful. It was more that I was adjusting the curriculum that I was teaching to my traditional setting students based off the videos. So I would say that the results that I gathered from this study, while there was the huge difference in the raw score data, because there were so few students involved in this study, like there's no way that I could actually run any sort of statistical analysis that would make any sense on this data. I did do standard deviation and find the range of these scores, but again, with such a small sample size, it's tough to extrapolate that data and make any sort of conclusions. Now, again, I don't really think that this is unlikely. What happened in my classroom, again, the lack of statistical difference is pretty much what was reported across the literature. Now, I think that this study might suggest that maybe the flipped classroom approach isn't quite as, groundbreaking as one thought. But again, I don't believe that you can actually make any sort of conclusions that are larger than the realm of my own classroom because the data sample size was so small. Now, I think that there are some things that definitely affected my data collection, and I would just say that my students I work really hard to build relationships with them in terms of the actual content and the material that we're studying. So while my students in the flip group were still able to spend time with me in class, like they didn't get my little quirks when I was teaching the content. They weren't able to see me and my emotions connected to the material that we were studying and hear my little stories about my own experiences in the industry. And I think that, the lack of those interactions might have had some sort of effect on the end goal. And again, it's not to say that the flipped group was lacking. It was just they might not have had as true of connection to the content. Now, as I said, when I was talking about the survey data, most students, if they were in the flip group, they were fine with it. I know another student in the survey data mentioned, I was nervous to be in the flip group, but whatever. Now, I purposely gave the survey data after the students learned about their test scores. So again, these weren't used for any sort of grading. It was just to determine their performance on this assessment and, to really study the gap between traditional instruction and flipped instruction. So again, the lack of statistical change is pretty common and expected. But however, this is my classroom of 16 advanced chemistry students who were placed in this course either because they are great at math or because they were looking for a challenge. So the outcomes could totally have been different had I done this exact study with my class of 28 general chemistry students, where I've got kids who are sophomores all the way through seniors who are definitely done being in high school. And you can question the outcomes and the data that I collected from them, but I think that this data would definitely change, probably depending on the unit of study. Now, the unit that we were studying when I collected this data was definitely a math light unit. So students who might excel more when performing calculations weren't really able to maybe shine during this unit because it was really more of a memorization and, embracing of a scientific culture in the way that we, communicate with other scientists about compounds and substances that we're using. So it's definitely not a secret that high school chemistry courses are just hard. And I don't know that the traditional classroom is really providing what students need to be successful in this class, especially with this whole push towards 21st century skills and the idea that problem solving is how we're going to approach instruction. And I think that change is really welcomed, especially in my own classroom, and it's coming and it's needed. And if we're going to continue on as being educators, we need to promote this change. So I think while the flipped approach is indeed a path that we could take, it might not be right for my students, or at least this specific group of students. But if nothing else, my own research should just promote educators everywhere to reevaluate the type of instruction that's occurring in his or her classroom, because we want what's best for our students. And I think that there's not much left to say other than to try to work on being better. And if you get to a point as an educator where you don't want to be better, I think that, that could be dangerous for some of your students and in terms of success and potential outcomes. So I think that while collecting data for my study was so, I don't want to say stressless because that's not exactly true, but having so few students, it just saved a bunch of time, and it was way less stressful to try to, contain all that data and organize it. But this is by no means complete. So I think students, really across the board should be studied in terms of flipped instruction. If I were really to extrapolate some data, I would have to study every single one of my students in every single setting across multiple units. In fact, another one of my students said that, and again, I'm not sure if this was a male or female, but one student said, I think that it would be beneficial for me if I could go back and forth between being in the flipped group and being in the traditional group. So success for this individual student was, it really looked differently depending on the types of units we were learning. So in particular, this student mentioned, the more math heavy units, he or she would want to be in the classroom so that, the exposure to this material was a little bit more meaningful. And I think that that's really interesting and really mature of a student to describe, because the idea that it's not just a one shoe fits all kind of thing. It's, you've got to have these models that are constantly changing for these students to be engaged and to be interacting with the content. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that this is sufficiently descriptive of my research. Thank you.